Hello everyone, my name is Kim Garcia, and for my final project for SPHS502, I decided to go with the General Motor Program GMP and demonstrate how it is applicable in the field of motor learning. Specifically, the motor program that I will be discussing is throwing and how that basic movement, given certain parameters, can be executed differently. For instance, in the sports of baseball versus football, and how this general motor program, the core movement, can be seen in both sports. And here we go. So the overview. As I mentioned, I will be going over the general motor program. I'll be defining GMP, so there's a basic understanding of what GMP is going into this presentation. And then I will be talking about the throwing phase, the phases that go into throwing and GMP and how that relates. And then we'll go into some videos showing my friends demonstrating throwing a football versus throwing a baseball. And then finally we'll discuss the parameters that helped affect the GMP. We'll be going over 4 different topics, and so here we go. So, GMP. What is GMP? Well, as defined by Richard Schmidt and Timothy Lee in their text, Motor Control and Learning, a Behavioral Emphasis, their 5th edition, GMP is a motor program whose expression can be varied depending on the choice of certain parameters. So what does this mean? Basically, in other words, this is a motor program for a particular class of action that is stored in one's memory, and in order to execute the GMP, certain parameters must be in place to define the movement. So throwing. Let's take this example of just throwing an object. In this case, we'll be throwing a baseball and a football. When it comes to throwing, the motion can be broken down into 5 main phases. The first phase being the wind-up phase, or it incorporates a stride into it, so wind-up or stride phase. And then the second phase is the cocking phase, and then acceleration, then deceleration, and follow-through. So, as I mentioned, the motor skill that I will be used to demonstrate this GMP is throwing a football versus throwing a baseball. The first video that will be on the next slide will be of my friend, Lieutenant Early, throwing a football. And the next video after that will be my friend, Lieutenant Diaz, throwing a baseball. So I want you to pay attention as the audience to see if you can see the 5 phases mentioned earlier, which again are wind-up / stride phase, the cocking phase, acceleration, deceleration, and follow-through within these videos. If you watch closely, you'll be able to see that the GMP, the basic core movement of throwing, is somewhat similar, but we'll break down into the parameters after that of what makes it different.
I can't throw that far.
So here we are demonstrating the motions of throwing a football.
So as you can see in the video, my friend here demonstrates the 5 stages. First, he did the wind-up phase where he stepped back to kind of build up his potential kinetic energy. And then as he progresses to continue the motion, you see him start to cock his arm back in order to gain some force behind his throw. And then he begins to accelerate his throw by stepping forward and allowing his arm to go forward. Then the deceleration is when he starts releasing the ball, and you see him at the end kind of hold his arm out, which completes the follow-through phase. So now that I've mentioned that through this video, let's try to see it in the next one.
So in this video, my friend here will be showing us how to pitch the baseball, and we will be going through the motor programs for that. Okay, thanks.
So in this one, it's a little more obvious where you see the wind-up phase. His left leg goes up and he is getting ready to throw the ball. He's getting all that momentum to drive behind it. He steps forward, his arm is cocked, and then he goes ahead and accelerates the motion. In this one, I asked him previously before the video started to kind of go slow because I realized in the football video it's not as slow. So this one provides a clear demonstration of the 5 phases. So again, here you see him cock his elbow, so he's in the second phase, and then he goes through. He's accelerating his motion. Then you see him decelerate as his arm is slowly reaching full extension, and once, if he had released the ball, you would have seen that he also have held his arm out, and he would be in the follow-through phase, which is the 5th one. So the parameters and the effects on GMP. Here we will be discussing 4 different parameters. The first 2 being muscles used and the order of activation and deactivation of the muscles. It's important to note that in phase 1 and 2, which is the wind up / stride and the cocking phases, the primary muscles that are activated in both the throwing of the baseball and throwing of the football are the posterior and middle deltoid. It's good to understand though too that throwing in general, the motion involves the whole body, but for the sake of just this talk, we are going to be talking about the upper body. So phase 3 and phase 4, which is acceleration and deceleration, you can see in both the first video and the second video that when they were going through these phases, the muscles activated were the posterior deltoid, the rotator cuffs, their internal rotators, or IR, their scapula and their triceps and biceps. Those were all fully engaged at the time to be able to have the acceleration and deceleration needed to complete the motor program. And lastly, phase 5, when they're doing the follow through after completing the motion, you can find that their internal rotators, their scapula, their triceps, the rotator cuff muscles are all activated for this motion. For the order of activation and deactivation of muscles, if we go back to that photo that was shown on slide 3 of this presentation, you can see that a better illustration of the delays and where things are happening. So, for instance, foot contact in the baseball phase, it's going a lot sooner than it is in the football cocking phase. And then the ER max, and when they release, and the IR max, so the external rotators and internal rotators. For the force of muscle contraction and duration of muscle contraction, the last 2 parameters that we'll be discussing, it was in the study done by Fleesig and company entitled Kinematic and Kinetic Comparison Between Baseball Pitching and Football Passing that I drew this information from. They provided a great breakdown of their study on how they got the measurements, how they were able to quantify it. So just pulling some information from their study, the force of muscle contraction, they found that pitchers achieved greater ball velocity and rotational speeds of the arm and trunk initially in the first phase. And then QBs have greater shoulder external rotation at the instant of foot contact. And then they also found that quarterbacks lead with their elbow. So what's it called? They seem to stand more erect, as we saw my friend Drew earlier. He seemed to be a little more erect when he did his follow through and his throw initially versus my friend Bradley, where his whole body was kind of leaning forward into that throw. So in the study, quarterbacks tend to lead with their elbows. That's what they found. And then it's displayed greater shoulder horizontal adduction and elbow flexion is what they concluded. And then lastly, they found that pitchers had greater upper torso angular velocity when conducting their motion versus the quarterback themselves. And that's apparent if you were to go back and watch the two videos in this presentation. And then lastly, the duration of muscle contraction. So in the study by Fleissig and company, they found that the muscle contraction required for baseball is a lot faster, like the timing needed for muscle contraction is quicker than the muscle contraction for football, because the motion for pitching it has to be super quick to get all of that force and power and speed behind the throw. Whereas football, when throwing, they have to be a little more patient. So depending on the options available during a route or a game, they might have to be in the cocking phase a little longer and then reset and start again. So that was the conclusion. So before we get into the summary, I just wanted to bring up why understanding GMP is kind of important. So understanding a core movement is beneficial, because then watching it translate in between different sports, like football and baseball, you can actually use different parameters like we discussed and help an athlete become more versatile in either in their sport, or actually help them grow to become more of an all-around athlete. So in the study conducted by Fleissig and company, they discussed how you can actually use the pitching movement to help a quarterback increase their speed and power when throwing the football. So by having your athlete practice a different sports movement, because you're holding a different kind of ball, the weight's different, and the movement is only slightly different, where, like we said, the football you're more leading with your elbow. With pitching, you're kind of throwing your whole body into it. You're not leading with your elbow, you're not sending as a rect. So being able to use the different set of parameters in one sport and being able to translate the core movement of throwing into another sport by just changing the parameters is very beneficial, as long as a coach understands what needs to be modified and how to help their athlete improve. So in conclusion, we discussed the general motor program, specifically throwing, and the 5 phases that it went down through. Then we talked about how the 2 motor skills, football throwing and baseball pitching, and how you could see the 5 phases in both sports, and showing how the GMP is transferable throughout different sport realms. And then we talked about the parameters that helped affect the execution of the GMP. These are my references, and I want to just lay it out there that I am no expert whatsoever. It's just a final project. I'm just trying to discuss how general motor programs are important and how they can be applicable in both coaching and just understanding motor learning itself. All right, thank you. This concludes my presentation.